The night was quiet in a way that only familiar houses can be. Not peaceful, not comforting, just quiet enough to let small sounds travel farther than they should. The kind of quiet where a single click, a soft rattle, can feel louder than a shout. The child padded barefoot across the hallway, half awake, guided by nothing more than habit. The light from the street lamp slipped through the curtains in pale stripes, stretching across the bedroom floor. This room still smelled faintly like clean, sheets and something older, something comforting that had not been replaced since her mother had already passed. She did not come in looking for trouble. Children rarely do. She came in because the door was open and because something about the room felt different tonight. The nightstand sat beside the bed, just where it always was. A book stacked neatly, a small lamp turned off, and beside it, something that did not belong there. A small plastic bottle. It caught the light when she moved closer, its surface smooth and slightly reflective. She stopped, tilted her head. Her mother used to keep things away from the edge. Always. Even before she had already passed, that had been one of those quiet rules. Not spoken often, but followed every day. The child reached out anyway. The bottle made a sound when her fingers touched it. A faint rattle. Soft, almost playful. Like something meant to be shaken. Her grip tightened. She did not know what it was, only that it was new. Only that it made noise. Only that it had been left where her hands could reach it. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard shifted as the air cooled. A distant car passed. The world kept moving, unaware of the small moment unfolding in this room. The child tried to twist the cap. It resisted. She frowned, concentrating, using both hands now. The bottle tilted, almost slipping from her grasp. For just a second, the cap loosened. Something changed in the room. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to slow her. Down. A shadow crossed the wall as a cloud passed the moon. The light dimmed. Her hands paused. She shook the bottle again. The sound was clearer now, distinct pieces moving inside. Curiosity replaced caution. She tipped the bottle, peering into the opening as the cap shifted again. And then suddenly the bottle slipped. It hit the carpet with a dull thud, not loud enough to wake anyone else. The cap popped just enough. One small tablet rolled free. It bounced once, twice, then disappeared, beneath the edge of the bed. The child froze. Her eyes tracked the sound, then the empty space where it had been. She dropped to her knees, peering into the darkness under the bed, heart beating faster for reasons she could not name. Somewhere deep inside, something felt wrong. She had felt that feeling before, usually followed by her mother's voice, gentle but firm. Not angry, never loud, just enough. She crawled closer, reaching an arm under the bed. Her fingers brushed dust, fabric, nothing, solid. She shifted, stretching farther. The silence pressed in. That was when the hallway light flickered on. Not bright, not sudden. Just enough glow slipping under the bedroom door to make her pause. She pulled her arm back. The tablet remained unseen, just out of reach. In the living room, a phone vibrated softly against a wooden surface. One short buzz, then silence again. The child sat back on her heels, distracted now. Her attention pulled away from the darkness under the bed toward the doorway, toward the light she hadn't turned on. She stood, the bottle forgotten on the floor beside her. Somewhere between one step and the next, the urge to keep searching faded, replaced by a simpler thought. Thirst. The need for water. A reason to leave the room. She walked out, leaving the bottle behind. Behind her, the bedroom returned to stillness. The tablet remained hidden. The bottle lay on its side, harmless for now. And if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed how close it had been. How a single second more, a single movement different, could have changed everything. but the house was quiet again. And the child was safe. For now. For now. She didn't run. She didn't even understand that she'd just stepped away from something dangerous. She just walked down the hallway with the slow, drifting focus of a child who had woken up for no big reason at all and now needed one small comfort to fall back asleep. The light under the bedroom door behind her looked wrong, like a thin line drawn by a hand that had trembled. She glanced back once, eyes half-lidded, then kept going. In the kitchen, the dark felt different, wider. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of dish soap and yesterday's dinner. The nightlight near the outlet glowed like a tiny moon, enough to outline the counter edges, the refrigerator door, the shape of a chair tucked in too far. She climbed onto the first chair like she'd done 100 times, careful but confident, and reached for the cup that always lived on the lower shelf. She found it by memory more than sight. Plastic, light, familiar in her hands. The tap squeaked softly when she turned it. Water ran. The sound filled the kitchen like it had been waiting for permission. She drank in small gulps, pausing between them, listening to the house settle. She always listened at night. Not because she was scared exactly, but because the house was different since her mother had already passed. The rooms held their breath longer. The corners felt deeper. The quiet wasn't simply quiet anymore, it was the space where someone used to be. She set the cup down, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and stood on the chair again, looking toward the hallway. The light was still on. She hadn't turned it on. She frowned, the way kids do when something doesn't match the picture in their heads. Then her gaze drifted to the living room, where the faintest glow leaked from a phone screen on the coffee table. Just a dim rectangle, face down, as if the screen itself was embarrassed to be awake. Another vibration came, softer than the first. It didn't ring. It didn't announce itself. It just nudged the wood once, like a knuckle tapping a door. The child watched it, mesmerized by the small movement, the idea that something could make noise without being touched. For a second, she forgot about the bedroom, forgot about the bottle, forgot about the darkness under the bed. Then the phone stopped. The glow disappeared. The kitchen returned to its earlier stillness, but the child had already been tugged back into motion. She slid off the chair and padded toward the living room, cup still in her hand, feet whispering against the floor. She approached the coffee table and reached for the phone with the same curiosity she had for everything. She knew she wasn't supposed to touch it. That was another unspoken rule, one of the quiet ones that had survived even after her mother had already passed. The rules weren't written down anywhere, but they lived in the way the remaining adult in the house spoke, the way their eyebrows tightened, the way their hands moved to take things away. The child didn't pick up the phone. She just leaned closer to it, studying the black glass. Her reflection was faint in it. A soft, oval face, messy hair, eyes that looked too awake for the hour. In the hallway, a floorboard creaked. Not a sharp sound, not a warning, just the house speaking in its sleep. The child froze, cup in both hands now. A moment later, a voice drifted out from somewhere deeper inside the home, low, tired, not angry, just heavy with sleep. "Sweetheart?" The child turned her head toward the hallway. Silence followed, the kind that comes when someone is listening for an answer. "I'm here," the child whispered, though her whisper was more breath than sound. A shuffling noise came from the bedroom at the end of the hall, an adult shifting, sitting up, pulling themselves from the edge of sleep. The child stood still, waiting. In the pause, her mind wandered back to the nightstand, to the bottle and the small sound it made when she shook it. The strange little roll under the bed, the tablet vanishing into darkness. She felt a pinch of worry now, but she couldn't explain it. It wasn't fear of punishment. It was something softer and more unsettling, the feeling of having touched something that wasn't meant for her. She clutched the cup tighter. The adult appeared in the hallway, hair flattened on one side, eyes narrowed against the light. They wore a loose shirt, one sock on, one sock missing, as if they'd put themselves together in a hurry. "What are you doing up?" the adult asked, voice still husky. "I was thirsty," the child said, lifting the cup as proof. The adult's shoulders lowered slightly. They stepped closer, taking in the kitchen, the phone on the table, the line of light still cutting under the bedroom door. Their gaze paused there, just a fraction longer than it should have. "Okay," the adult said, softer now. "Come on. Let's go back to bed." The child nodded and followed. She walked beside the adult down the hallway, watching their hand brush the wall for balance, watching the small, tired movements of someone doing their best. The child knew, in the way children know things without naming them, that the adult was alone in a way she wasn't, that the adult carried the weight of the house because the person who used to share it had already passed. As they approached the child's bedroom, the adult reached out and gently pushed the door more closed, narrowing the strip of light. The hallway dimmed. The child looked toward her own room, then toward the other bedroom, the one that used to belong to her mother. That room had changed over time, not erased, not turned into something else, but made quieter, less lived in. The bed still made, the nightstand still there. Some things kept in place because moving them felt like admitting something final. The adult guided the child into her bed, pulling the blanket up. The child held the cup out. The adult took it and set it on the dresser. "You okay?" the adult asked, brushing hair from the child's forehead. The child almost said yes. Almost. Then her mouth opened and the truth slipped out in a clumsy child shape. "There was a bottle," she whispered. The adult's hand paused on her hair. "A bottle?" the adult echoed. "In her room," the child said, eyes darting toward the hallway as if the bottle could hear its name. "On the table. It made noise." A quiet, careful stillness settled over the adult's face. Not panic, not yet, but alertness, waking fully behind tired eyes. "What kind of bottle?" the adult asked. The child tried to find the words. Little, white, shaky. The adult swallowed. They stood, moving slowly, as if sudden movement might crack the moment into something worse. They leaned down again, keeping their voice gentle. "Did you open it?" they asked. The child hesitated, caught between honesty and the instinct to avoid trouble. Then she nodded, just a tiny nod. It fell. The adult's breath came out in a controlled exhale. They smoothed the blanket again, making the child feel tucked in even as their attention was already reaching toward the other room. "Stay here," the adult said softly. "I'll be right back." The child nodded again, but the adult didn't fully trust that nod. They could not. Not with the knowledge pressing at the edges of their mind now. They stepped into the hallway, leaving the child's door mostly open. The child watched them go, her eyes following the shadow of their body down the hall, toward the room that still carried her mother's absence like perfume you couldn't wash out. The adult reached the bedroom and flipped on the lamp. Warm light spilled onto the bed, onto the nightstand, onto the carpet where the bottle lay on its side. The adult's face tightened as they crossed the room quickly. They recognized the bottle, immediately, because it should not have been there. It was supposed to be in the high cabinet in the bathroom. That was where they kept things like that now. Out of reach, out of sight. They were usually careful. They had to be. They didn't have anyone else to share the watching. Their fingers wrapped around the bottle and lifted it. The cap was loosened. Their thumb pressed it down, testing. Too loose. Their stomach dropped, cold and fast. They turned the bottle upright and looked inside. The tablets shifted with a soft clatter. They didn't count them one by one. There wasn't time for that. and in the dim light they'd never be sure anyway. But they could tell by the way the tablet sat, by the shape of the empty space near the top. Something might be missing. They forced themselves to breathe, slow, careful. Panic would only make their hands clumsy. They lowered to their knees and swept a hand across the carpet, feeling for anything. Nothing. Then they leaned down, peering under the bed. It was darker under there than they expected, a pocket of shadow that swallowed the light from the lamp. They reached for the flashlight on the nightstand drawer, flicked it on, and aimed it low. Dust bunnies, a stray sock, the edge of a small toy that had rolled here months ago. And then a pale circle, far back, one tablet. The adult's heart slammed against their ribs. Relief and fear arrived at the same time, tangled together. One pill was under the bed. That was something. That was proof that the child had gotten far enough for it to fall out. But it did not guarantee that only one had fallen out. The adult stretched an arm under the bed, reaching. Their fingers brushed the tablet but pushed it farther back. Their breath hitched. "Come on," they murmured, not to the tablet, but to themselves. They shifted their weight, lay flatter, reached again with the tips of their fingers until finally they pinched the tablet and pulled it out. They held it in their palm like it was a glass, one accounted for. They stared at it for a second, the way you stare at something that almost became a disaster, the way your mind insists on replaying the what if even as your body is trying to calm down. Then they stood quickly, bottle in one hand, tablet in the other, and crossed the room to the trash can. They didn't throw the tablet away. Not yet. They set it down on the nightstand, away from the edge, and twisted the cap of the bottle until it clicked tight. They needed to be sure. They moved back to the bed, swept the flashlight beam across the carpet again, scanning for any other pale shapes. Nothing. They checked the edge of the rug. Nothing. They lifted the sheet that brushed the floor. Nothing. Their mind raced through the possibilities. The child could have dropped one. The child could have picked one up. The child could have put it in her mouth and then, no. Don't go there, not without evidence. Don't invent horror when you can still act. They turned off the flashlight and stood in the center of the room, holding the bottle like it was suddenly heavy. The house around them felt too still, too patient, like it knew how close they'd come. On the nightstand, beside the lamp, there was a framed photo, old, slightly faded. The child's mother, smiling in a way that made your throat tighten, a hand resting on the child's shoulder when she was smaller. The adult's gaze flicked to it without permission. Even after she had already passed, that smile still did. Something to the air in the room. It still made the adult feel watched, not judged, not haunted, just seen. Like a reminder that someone once cared for this child with a fullness the adult was still trying to learn how to carry alone. The adult swallowed hard and turned back toward the hallway. They needed to check the child. Immediately. They stepped out and moved quickly, bottle held high now. As they passed the child's room, they saw her small shape under the blanket, eyes open, watching. The key. Adult forced their face to soften. They stepped inside and lowered their voice. "It's okay," they said. "You did the right thing telling me." The child blinked, absorbing that kindness like warmth. The adult sat on the edge of the bed. Their hand moved to the child's cheek, a gentle touch. "Did you put anything in your mouth?" they asked, as calmly as they could. The child shook her head. "No." "Did you taste anything? Like bitter?" The adult tried. The child frowned. "No, I just looked." The adult searched her face, watching her eyes, her breathing, the steadiness of her voice. Children could lie, but their bodies often told the truth. Tonight, the child looked tired, confused, a little guilty, but not sick. Relief loosened something in the adult's chest, but it didn't erase the fear completely. "Okay," the adult said softly. "We're going to keep you safe, all right?" The child nodded, her lower lip trembling slightly now that she understood this had been serious. "I didn't know." "No," the adult whispered. "You didn't know." They sat there for a moment, the adult's hand still on the child's cheek, the child leaning into it. The adult thought of the mother, how she would have handled this. Not with anger, not with fear, with calm, with structure, with love. Even after she had already passed, the shape of that love still guided the adult's hands, the way a memory can teach you how to move. The adult stood. "I'm going to put this away somewhere very high," they said, holding up the bottle so the child could see it. "And then you're going to try to sleep. Can you do that?" The child nodded again. The adult walked out, heading toward the bathroom this time, toward the high cabinet. They put the bottle inside, pushed it deep back, and closed the door. They tested the latch twice. Then they leaned on the sink for a second, letting their breath shake out quietly. They turned the tap on, splashed water on their face, and stared at their own reflection. Just one mistake. One tired moment. One bottle left in the wrong place. That's all it took. They turned off the tap and returned to the hallway. The child's door was still open. The adult stepped toward it and stopped, because the strip of light under the mother's bedroom door was back. But they had turned that lamp off. They were sure they had. The adult's heart tightened. They turned their heads slowly toward that door, and in that thin line of warm light, they saw something move, low to the ground, small and silent, slipping out from under the bed and rolling across the carpet toward the door like a pale, perfect circle that should not be moving on its own. The adult stood frozen in the hallway, breath caught halfway in, eyes locked on the thin line of light under the bedroom door. For a second, only a second, their mind reached for something impossible, something unreal. But it stopped itself just as quickly. This house did not work that way. Nothing did. They forced their breathing to slow. The light wasn't bright. It wasn't growing. It was just there, a narrow stripe spilling onto the carpet, like it always did when the lamp inside that room was on and the door wasn't fully closed. And the movement they thought they'd seen, low, pale, rolling, could have been anything. A trick of shadow, a shift in light, dust catching the beam at the wrong angle. They took one careful step closer. The carpet muffled the sound of their feet. The house stayed quiet, but not tense, just awake in the way old houses sometimes were, adjusting to temperature, air, the subtle pressure changes of night. They reached the door and pushed it open. The lamp was on. That alone made their chest tighten. They were sure they had turned it off. Sure. They remembered the click, the brief darkness afterward. Memory could be unreliable, they knew that, especially when fear crept in. But this didn't feel like that kind of mistake. They stepped inside slowly, scanning the room. Everything looked normal. Too normal. The bed was still neatly made. The nightstand was clear, except for the framed photo and the lamp. The bottle was gone, just as it should be. The carpet lay flat and undisturbed. Nothing was rolling across it. The adult exhaled, tension easing a fraction. They rubbed a hand over their face and let out a quiet, humorless breath. Get a grip, they told themselves. They crossed the room and turned the lamp off. This time, they watched the light disappear, watched the shadows settle. They stood there a moment longer, making sure nothing changed on its own. Nothing did. They turned to leave, hand already on the door, when they noticed something near the baseboard. A tiny white shape, barely visible against the pale carpet. Their hearts skipped. They crouched closer now and reached out. It was the tablet, the one they had pulled from under the bed. It lay several feet from where they'd left it on the nightstand. The adults stared at it, mind racing backward. They were certain they hadn't dropped it. Certain they'd placed it flat on the wood, away from the edge. Certain it hadn't been anywhere near the floor when they turned to leave earlier. They looked up, scanning the room again. The window. It was cracked open. Just a little. Enough for cool night air to slip inside. The adult straightened slowly, understanding dawning with a mix of relief and unease. The air outside was colder than inside. Pressure differences. A draft, subtle but steady, flowing across the room. The tablet was small, light. It didn't need anything supernatural to move. Just time. Just air. The adult knelt again, picked it up, and closed the window firmly. The curtain shifted, then stilled. They held the tablet tightly in their palm, grounding themselves in the reality of it. That was it, they told themselves. Just physics. Just a mistake followed by another small oversight. But even as logic settled things into place, their nerves didn't fully relax, because none of that explained why the lamp had been on again. They placed the tablet back on the nightstand, this time pushing it into the shallow dish that usually held a watch no one wore anymore. They turned the lamp on and off twice, making sure the switch worked properly. It did. They stood there listening to the room breathe. Finally, they turned and left, closing the door firmly behind them. The hallway felt different now. Not threatening, just heavy. The adult walked back toward the child's room, their steps slower, more deliberate. Inside, the child lay awake, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She looked small under the blanket, her hair fanned across the pillow. She turned her head when the adult entered. "You didn't sleep," the adult said softly. The child shook her head. "I was thinking." "About what?" The child hesitated, choosing her words carefully, the way children did when they knew something mattered, but didn't know why. "About her room," she said. The adult sat down on the edge of the bed. "What? About it?" "It felt busy," the child said. "Like when she used to clean." The adult's throat tightened. They forced their voice to stay even. "Busy how?" "Like things were moving," the child said, "but not loud." The adult didn't answer right away. They brushed the child's hair back gently, grounding both of them in the moment. "Sometimes houses make noises," the adult said, "especially at night." The child considered that. "But it felt like she didn't want me to touch it." The adult closed, their eyes for a brief second. Even after she had already passed, the child still spoke about her mother in the present tense sometimes, not because she thought she was still there, but because the feeling of her lingered, in habits, in instincts, in the invisible lines that shaped what felt right and what didn't. The adult chose their words carefully. "Your mom cared a lot about keeping you safe," they said. "That doesn't go away." The child nodded slowly, as if that explanation fit something she already knew. The adult stood. "Try to sleep," they said. "I'll be right here." They pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down, settling in for the long watch that followed moments like this. The child's breathing gradually slowed. Her eyes fluttered, then closed. Her grip on the blanket loosened. The adult stayed still, listening. Minutes passed, then more. Their thoughts kept circling back to the bottle, to how easily it could have gone wrong, to how close they'd come without realizing it until the danger had almost passed. They thought about how tired they'd been earlier, how routine could dull awareness, how the absence of the child's mother meant there was no one else to catch those small mistakes. The weight of that responsibility pressed in. Eventually, the child fell into deeper sleep. The adult stood carefully, not wanting to wake her, and stepped out into the hallway again. They didn't go to their own bed. Instead, they returned to the mother's room. They stood in the doorway this time, not turning on the light, just looking. The room felt calm now, empty, but not hollow, like a space that had settled after being disturbed. They stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed. Their eyes drifted to the photo on the nightstand. The smile in it still carried warmth, still carried reassurance. "You'd have caught it sooner," the adult whispered. "You always did." They didn't expect an answer. They didn't hear one. But as they sat there, the tightness in their chest eased slightly, as if speaking it out loud had helped. They stood and turned off the lamp, this time leaving it off. They closed the door and returned to the hallway. Halfway back to the child's room, they stopped. A sound reached them from the kitchen. Soft, distinct, the unmistakable rattle of plastic on wood. Their stomach dropped. They moved quickly now, not running but close to it, heart pounding. In the kitchen, the nightlight still glowed faintly. The table stood where it always did, and on it, a second bottle, not the same one. Another prescription bottle, this one smaller, darker, its label half peeled. It sat near the edge of the table, exactly where the phone had been earlier. The adult stared at it, mind racing. They knew this bottle. They had taken it earlier that evening, set it down just for a second while answering a message, meaning to put it away, meaning to come back to it, meaning to remember. They hadn't. The rattle came again as the bottle vibrated slightly, settling from whatever shift had caused the sound. Nothing moved it now. It was perfectly still. The adult stepped closer, slowly, eyes never leaving it. They picked it up and twisted the cap, checking. Locked. Thank God. They leaned on the table, breath shaking. One bottle was an accident. Two was a pattern. They closed their eyes, the weight of it pressing in again. The house hadn't been warning them. There was no magic here, no invisible hands, just a series of small, human mistakes stacking on top of each other. They put the bottle away immediately, high and out of reach, then stood there in the kitchen, staring at the quiet room. They thought of the child asleep down the hall, thought of how close curiosity and danger lived to each other, thought of how thin the line really was. They turned off the kitchen light and headed back toward the child's room. Halfway there, something else caught their eye. The child's door. It was open wider than before. The adult hadn't opened it. Their heart kicked hard against their ribs. They took one careful step closer, peering inside. The bed was empty. The blanket lay rumpled, pushed aside. The room was silent. And from somewhere deeper in the house, soft, curious, unaware of the danger still lingering, a small voice whispered her mother's name. The adult moved, not fast enough to make noise, not slow enough to lose time. That careful middle ground where panic was held back by instinct. Their eyes swept the child's. Room first, confirming what they already knew. Empty bed, blanket half on the floor, the small nightlight still glowing, unchanged, indifferent. "Sweetheart," they called softly, keeping their voice level. No answer. The adult stepped fully into the room, checking the closet, the corner behind the door, the narrow space beside the dresser where toys sometimes rolled and children sometimes hid. Nothing. The window was closed, the screen intact. No sign she'd gone outside. Another whisper drifted, from somewhere else in the house, not louder, not urgent, just curious. "Mom!" The adult turned toward the hallway, pulse hammering now, and followed the sound. They moved past the mother's bedroom without looking in. The door was closed. The light was off. The adult registered it without stopping, filing it away for later. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered. They reached the living room and paused, scanning. The couch, the armchair, the coffee table where the phone still lay, dark now. The sliding door to the backyard remained locked, curtain still drawn. The child wasn't there. Another small sound came from the kitchen, bare feet against tile, the soft scrape of a chair leg. The adult's chest tightened. They crossed the living room quickly, rounding the corner into the kitchen. The child stood with her back to them, one foot hooked on the lower rung of a chair, hands resting on the table's edge. She wore her pajamas, slightly twisted from sleep, hair messy and falling into her eyes. She looked small against the counter, impossibly small for how much danger could fit in a moment like this. "Hey," the adult said gently. "What are you doing?" The child turned, startled, but not scared. "I heard something," she said. "I thought it was her." The adult stepped closer, heart pounding but voice steady. "What did you hear?" The child shrugged. "Like a noise. Like when she used to come get water." The adult swallowed. They reached out, placing a hand on the back of the chair to steady it. "You can't climb like that in the dark," they said softly. "I wasn't," the child said quickly. "I was just looking." The adult followed her gaze. On the table, closer to the edge than it should have been, sat the cup from earlier. Empty now. Beside it, barely noticeable unless you knew what you were looking for, was something else. A small, pale tablet. The adult's vision tunneled. For a second, the room felt too bright, too sharp. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of the wall clock, seemed suddenly amplified. "Did you touch that?" the adult asked. The child looked down, confused. "What?" "The little white thing," the adult said, forcing calm into each word. "Did you touch it?" The child leaned closer, peering at it. "It was there," she said. "It rolled." The adult closed their eyes for half a heartbeat. "How long has it been there?" they asked. "I don't know," the child said. "I came in and it was on the table." The adult's mind raced backward. They had been sure they'd checked everything. Sure they'd accounted for the tablet under the bed. But that one, they had set it on the nightstand. Hadn't they? Had it been another one? Or had the child found this one earlier, before they'd even known to look? The adult reached out and swept the tablet into their palm, closing their fingers around it tightly. "Did you put it in your mouth?" they asked again, more carefully this time. "No," the child said, her voice firm. "It smells weird." Relief hit hard enough to make the adult dizzy. They leaned their free hand on the table, grounding themselves. "Okay," they said quietly. "That's good. That's very good." The child watched them, sensing the shift. "Am I in trouble?" "No," the adult said immediately. "You're not in trouble." They crouched down so they were eye level. "I just need you to tell me everything you touched tonight. Even little things. Can you do that?" The child nodded, serious now. "The bottle in her room," she said. "Then the cup. Then the phone buzzed. Then I went back to bed. Then I heard something and came here." The adult listened carefully, weighing each detail. "What did you hear?" they asked. The child frowned. "I don't know, like something moving, but soft." The adult glanced around the kitchen again. The chair, the table, the counters. Nothing looked out of place. No bottles, no blister packs, no open bags, but the tablet had been there. The adult stood slowly, lifting the child off the chair and setting her gently on the floor. "Stay right here," they said. "Don't move." They crossed the kitchen and opened the trash can, then stopped. No, they needed to be absolutely sure. They placed the tablet on the counter, away from the edge, and grabbed a paper towel, folding it around the pill before sealing it in a small plastic bag from a drawer. They labeled it with a marker, hands shaking just enough to make the letters crooked. Then they turned back to the child. "I'm going to check something," they said. "I need you to stay with me." They took the child's hand and walked back toward the hallway, this time turning into the bathroom. The adult flipped on the light and opened the high cabinet. The bottle was still there, cap tight. Tablets intact, as far as they could tell. They opened the medicine drawer below the sink. Empty. They checked the countertop, the toothbrush holder, the shelf above the toilet. Nothing. They moved quickly but methodically now, taking the child with them room by room. The living room, the couch cushions, the coffee table, the side table, the mother's room again, briefly, light on this time. The nightstand clear. The dish where the tablet had been was empty now. The adult's heart sank. They retraced their steps, mind replaying the evening. There had been 2 bottles, one in the mother's room, one in the kitchen. They'd put both away. They were sure of it. So where had this tablet come from? They knelt and looked under the coffee table, under the couch, near the rug. Nothing. The adult stood, chest tight. They turned to the child. "When you were in the kitchen," they asked gently, "did you move anything?" The child shook her head. "I just climbed to see." The adult nodded slowly. They guided the child back to her room and sat her on the bed. "I'm going to sit with you for a minute," they said, "just to make sure everything's okay." The child curled under the blanket again, clutching it with small hands. Her eyes were wide now, reflecting the seriousness she'd sensed but didn't fully understand. The adult sat beside her, one hand resting lightly on her back. They listened, counted breaths, watched for any sign, sleepiness, nausea, anything out of place. Minutes passed. The child yawned. "You're tired," the adult said. "Can you stay?" the child asked. "Yes," the adult said. "I'm not going anywhere." The child's breathing slowed. Her eyelids fluttered. The adult stayed still, vigilant, letting the house settle. Again. After a while, the child slipped back into sleep. The adult waited longer this time before standing. They moved quietly, stepping back into the hallway, closing the child's door almost all the way. They leaned against the wall and closed their eyes, letting the adrenaline ebb. That was when they heard it. Not from the kitchen, not from the living room, from the mother's room. A soft click. The adult opened their eyes. It was the sound of a plastic cap twisting. Their heart dropped into their stomach. They pushed off the wall and moved toward the sound, every sense sharpened. The door to the mother's room was closed. They reached it, hand hovering over the knob. Another sound followed, a faint rattle, from inside. The adult swallowed hard, hand tightening on the door handle. Because they knew, absolutely knew, that every bottle had been put away. And no one else was supposed to be in that room. They turned the handle and pushed the door open. The lamp was off. The room was dark. But on the nightstand, faintly illuminated by the streetlight through the curtain, sat a bottle that had not been there before, its cap loose. And beside it, resting near the edge, was not one tablet, but several. The adult didn't step into the room right away. They stood in the doorway, one hand still on the handle, the other braced against the doorframe, as if the room itself might tilt. The air inside felt cooler, carrying that faint, familiar scent of clean fabric and something older that never quite faded. The nightstand sat where it always had. The lamp was off. The curtain stirred just slightly, breathing with the street air outside. And there, unmistakable now, was the bottle. Several tablets lay beside it, pale against the dark wood, close enough to the edge that gravity alone could finish what exhaustion had almost begun earlier. The adult's mind snapped into motion. Not fear, not wonder. Inventory. They crossed the room quickly and scooped the tablets into their palm, counting without thinking, fingers moving on instinct. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They pressed them together, feeling their smoothness, their weight. They were cool, real, ordinary, too ordinary for how dangerous they were. They twisted the cap shut until it clicked, then twisted again to be sure. The bottle didn't fight them. It hadn't been defective. It hadn't been faulty. It had simply been open. The adult looked around the room, scanning for explanations the way they'd learned to do since. The child's mother had already passed. When there was no one else to share the watching, you learned to doubt your first conclusion and search for the second. The window, still cracked. The curtain, light enough to move with air. The nightstand, close to the edge. The shallow dish, empty now, sitting where they'd placed it earlier. They exhaled through their nose. They remembered. Earlier that evening, before the child had woken, they had stood in this room for a moment longer than usual. They had picked up the photo on the nightstand, had brushed dust from the frame with their sleeve, had set it back down, and then their phone had buzzed, just once. They'd answered it without thinking. A message, a distraction, a step toward the door. They had not remembered placing the bottle there, but they could see it now, clearly enough to make their stomach turn. They had likely set it down while their hands were full, meaning to put it away, meaning to come back, meaning had not been enough. The adult closed their eyes and let the truth land, not the supernatural kind, not the comforting kind, the human kind, the kind that came from being tired and alone and trying to do everything without dropping anything important. They moved to the dresser and opened the top drawer, pushing the bottle deep inside this time, behind folded shirts, behind things that didn't move. They closed the drawer and leaned against it, steadying themselves. 5 tablets. 5 moments where everything could have changed. They stood there until their heart stopped racing, until their breathing evened out again. Then they remembered the child. They turned and left the room quickly, closing the door behind them, not locking it, but making sure it stayed closed. They moved down the hallway, their steps quiet, measured. The child's door was still mostly closed. The nightlight inside cast a soft glow under it. The adult opened it slowly and slipped in. The child lay on her side, one arm tucked under her, pillow, breathing steady. Her face looked peaceful again, the way it did when sleep finally pulled her under. The adult watched her chest rise and fall, counting breaths without realizing they were doing it. 1, 2, 3. They sat on the edge of the bed and rested a hand lightly on the mattress, not touching her at first, just being there, present. After a moment, the child stirred. Her eyelids fluttered. She didn't wake fully, but her brow furrowed. "Mom?" she murmured, voice barely there. The adult's throat tightened. They didn't correct her. They didn't explain. They simply leaned closer and spoke softly. "I'm here," they said. The child relaxed again, the tension leaving her face. Her breathing deepened. The adult stayed longer this time, longer than they needed to, longer than was practical. They stayed until the house felt quiet in a different way, not alert, not waiting, just settled. Eventually, they stood and left the room, closing the door gently behind them. They didn't go back to bed. Instead, they moved through the house with purpose now, checking, rechecking, resetting the small systems that kept a child safe when no one was watching. Cabinets latched, drawers closed, counters cleared, chairs pushed in, doors locked, windows shut. Each action felt like an apology spoken without words. They finished in the kitchen, standing at the sink, staring at their reflection in the dark glass of the window. Their eyes looked older than they felt. Tired in a way, sleep wouldn't fix. They thought of the mother again, of how she had moved through this same space, hands always busy, always adjusting, how she'd had a way of noticing the small things before they became problems. Even after she had already passed, the shape of her care still seemed to linger, like a pattern the house remembered even when the people inside forgot. The adult turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment longer, listening. Nothing rattled. Nothing shifted. They went to the living room and sank onto the couch, head in their hands, letting the adrenaline finally drain away. Their bodies shook now that it no longer had to be still. It had been close. Too close. They sat there until the clock ticked past the hour, until their muscles loosened and their thoughts slowed. Eventually, they stood and went to their own bedroom, closing the door behind them. They lay down fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. Sleep came in pieces, dreamless, thin. They woke to light. Morning filtered through the curtains in pale bands, turning the room soft and ordinary again. For a moment, the adult lay still, unsure if the night had been as real as it felt. Then memory returned, sharp and immediate. They sat up and swung their legs over the side of the bed, moving quickly now, urgency back in their step. They opened the door and headed straight for the child's room. The door was open. The child was gone. The adult's heart jumped, but not as violently this time. They listened. From the kitchen came the sound of a chair scraping softly across tile. "Hey!" the adult called, already moving. "I'm here!" the child answered. The adult entered the kitchen to find the child sitting at the table, legs swinging, humming to herself. She held a crayon in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. On the table were a cup of water, a bowl of cereal, and nothing else. The adult let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. "Good morning," they said, forcing a smile. "Morning," the child said, cheerful now, night forgotten. The adult checked the table with their eyes, quick and thorough. No bottles, no tablets, no hazards. They poured coffee and sat across from the child, watching her draw looping shapes on the paper. "What are you making?" they asked. "A house," the child said, "with a window." The adult nodded. "That's nice." The child colored quietly for a minute, then looked up. "She doesn't like the table," she said, suddenly. The adult froze, coffee halfway to their mouth. "Who?" they asked carefully. The child shrugged. "Mom. She doesn't like when things are on the edge." The adult swallowed. "You remember that?" they asked. The child nodded. "She used to move them, like this." She reached out and slid the crayon away from the edge of the table, pushing it safely toward the center. The adult stared at the small motion, feeling something deep in their chest loosen and ache at the same time. "That's right," they said softly. They finished breakfast and walked the child to school, holding her hand a little tighter than usual. The day unfolded normally after that. Work, messages, chores. The kind of ordinary hours that made the night before feel unreal, like something imagined in exhaustion. By afternoon, the adult almost convinced themselves that they had overreacted. That fear had filled in gaps that didn't exist, that it had simply been a bad night. They picked the child up from school and brought her home. The house greeted them with its usual quiet. The adults set their keys down on the counter and helped the child with her shoes. "Can I draw in your room?" the child asked. The adult hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but stay where I can hear you." The child ran down the hallway, humming again, disappearing into the adult's bedroom this time. The adult moved through the kitchen, starting dinner, letting the rhythm of normalcy settle in again. Chopping, stirring, setting a timer. From the hallway came the soft sound of paper shifting, crayons rolling. The adult relaxed. Then the timer went off. They turned to silence it, hands wet, attention pulled away for just a moment. Behind them, from the hallway, came a sound that did not belong to crayons. A familiar, unmistakable rattle. Plastic on wood. The adult's blood went cold. They turned slowly. The sound came again. From their bedroom, the adult's heart slammed against their ribs as they dropped the towel and moved toward the hallway, fear and focus colliding. They reached the bedroom door and stopped. Inside, the child sat on the floor, drawing, and on the nightstand beside the bed, freshly placed, impossible, undeniable, sat a small plastic bottle, its cap tilted, tablets visible through the opening. The adult stared at it, mind reeling. They knew they had checked everything. They knew they had put everything away. They knew, absolutely knew, that bottle did not belong there. The child looked up, smiling. "It was already here," she said. The adult stepped forward, every instinct screaming, every explanation failing, because this time the window was closed, the drawer was empty, and the bottle was warm as if it had only just been set down. The adult didn't touch the bottle right away. They stood there, one foot just inside the doorway, the other still in the hallway, as if crossing the threshold too quickly might make the moment worse. The room smelled faintly of crayons and paper. Ordinary, safe. The child sat on the floor, legs crossed, completely absorbed in her drawing, the danger beside her as unnoticed as a loose stone on a familiar path. The bottle sat on the nightstand, exactly where it should never be, not close to the edge this time, placed deliberately near the center, as if someone had taken care to set it down properly. The adult's first instinct was to rush forward, to grab it, to end the moment before it could stretch any further. But they stopped themselves. They needed to understand how it was here. "Sweetheart," the adult said softly, keeping their voice steady. "Can you tell me when you saw that bottle?" The child looked up, following their gaze. Her smile faded into a thoughtful frown. "It was there when I came in," she said. "I didn't touch it." "Did you bring it from somewhere else?" the adult asked gently. The child shook her head. "No. I just came to draw." The adult nodded slowly. They stepped closer now, careful not to startle her, and reached for the bottle. It was warm, just as they'd noticed. Not hot, not cold. The warmth of something that had been held recently. They twisted the cap. It clicked closed easily, too easily. Inside, the tablets shifted. The sound made the adult's stomach twist, but they kept their expression neutral. They crouched and set the bottle on the dresser instead, farther from the child, farther from temptation. "Okay," they said quietly. "I need you to come with me for a minute." The child stood without protest. The adult took her hand and led her out of the room, closing the door behind them this time. They walked down the hallway together, back to the kitchen, where the smell of dinner still hung in the air. The adult lifted the child onto a chair at the table and sat across from her, their hands wrapped tightly around a mug they hadn't realized they'd picked up. "I'm going to ask you something important," the adult said, "and I need you to tell me the truth, even if it feels strange." The child nodded, solemnly. "Did anyone come into the house today?" the adult asked. "Anyone at all?" The child's brow furrowed. "You did. And me." "No one else?" the adult pressed. The child hesitated. Then she shrugged. "I heard the door earlier." The adult's grip tightened on the mug. "What door?" "The front one," the child said. "It made the sound." The adult's mind raced. They replayed the afternoon, coming home, keys on the counter, shoes, dinner prep. Had they locked the door? They were almost sure they had. Almost. "What time was that?" the adult asked. "I don't know," the child said, "before I was drawing." "Did you see anyone?" the adult asked. The child shook her head. "No, but I thought it was you again." The adult leaned back in their chair, heart pounding now for a different reason. This explanation didn't feel frightening in the way the night had. It felt heavier, more real. They stood and walked to the front door, checking the lock. It was secure now. They checked the chain. Intact. They glanced at the small table beside the door where mail sometimes piled up. There, sitting neatly on top, was a folded envelope they didn't recognize. The adult picked it up slowly. It wasn't addressed. No stamp. Just a name written in familiar handwriting on the front. The child's name. Their throat went dry. They opened it carefully. Inside was a single piece of paper. No message. Just a reminder list written in neat, careful lines. Medicine away, windows closed, nothing on the edge. The adult stared at the words, pulse roaring in their ears. They recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the mother's. Not recent, not fresh. The ink was slightly faded, the paper creased like it had been folded and unfolded many times. This wasn't new, it was old. Something she must have written months ago, maybe longer, and tucked away somewhere safe. The adult lowered themselves into the chair, the list trembling slightly in their hand. Of course this house was full of these. Things, notes, habits, systems built long before she had already passed. Systems that had kept a child safe when there had been two adults to watch, two sets of hands to catch small mistakes. The bottle in the bedroom, the one in the kitchen, they hadn't appeared out of nowhere. They had been found. The adult closed their eyes, memory rearranging itself with new clarity. Earlier that afternoon, while the child had been at school, they'd cleaned the closet in the mother's room, opened boxes they hadn't touched in months, moved things around. They remembered setting a small box aside, a box of old reminders, old systems, old routines. They had left it on the bed, and then the phone had rung. The adult stood abruptly and walked back down the hallway to the mother's room. They opened the closet door and knelt, pulling out the box they'd pushed aside earlier. Inside were folded notes, old planners, labeled bags, and at the bottom, 2 prescription bottles. They hadn't been appearing. They had been uncovered. The adult pressed a hand to their forehead, letting the truth settle. They had disturbed a system that had once worked flawlessly. And in doing so, they'd brought old dangers back into reach without realizing it. They carried the box to the kitchen table and began sorting immediately. Bottles sealed and placed high, notes folded and put away. The reminder list set aside carefully. The child watched quietly, sensing the seriousness without fear. "Your mom used to write things down," the adult said softly. "To help her remember?" The child nodded. "She didn't like forgetting." "No," the adult agreed. "She didn't." They finished putting everything away. The house felt calmer again, not because something invisible had changed, but because order had been restored. Because the adult had taken back the vigilance that exhaustion had blurred. Later, after dinner, after bath time, after the child was tucked into bed again, the adult sat alone in the living room, the reminder list folded neatly on the table beside them. Even after she had already passed, the mother's care had been there, not as magic, not as something unseen moving objects in the dark, but as preparation, as foresight, as systems designed to protect a child even when someone else had to take over. The adult exhaled, a mix of grief and gratitude tightening their chest. They stood and walked one last time through the house, checking each room. Everything was where it should be. They turned off the lights and headed to bed. Sleep came more easily this time, but just before drifting off, the adult remembered something else. The bottle in the bedroom had been warm. They sat up suddenly, heart thudding again. Because even with everything explained, even with every bottle accounted for, there was one detail that didn't fit. The adult had opened that box hours earlier, long before the child had gone to her room, long before dinner, and the bottle had not been warmed then. They lay back slowly, staring at the ceiling, the house quiet around them. Somewhere in the silence, a floorboard creaked, and the adult realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with fear, they still didn't know who had set the bottle on the nightstand last. The thought stayed with the adult long after the house had gone still again. They lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar nighttime sounds reassert themselves. The distant hum of a refrigerator cycling on and off, a car passing somewhere, down the street. The faint tick of cooling pipes settling into place. Normal sounds, comforting even, and yet the question wouldn't loosen its grip. Who had set the bottle on the nightstand last? They turned onto their side, then onto their back again. The reminder list lay folded on the kitchen table, exactly where they'd left it. The box from the closet was sorted, emptied, its contents safely redistributed to places that made sense now. Cabinets latched, drawers closed, high shelves truly, high again. There was no reason for anything to be out of place. And still. The adult forced themselves to breathe slowly, deliberately. This wasn't the first night since the child's mother had already passed that exhaustion had made thoughts spiral. Grief had a way of pulling small uncertainties into sharp focus, giving them more weight than they deserved. They closed their eyes. Sleep came, shallow at first, then deeper. They woke to the sound of rain, not heavy rain, not dramatic, just a steady, patient tapping against the roof and windows, the kind that blurred the edges of the morning. The light filtering into the bedroom was muted, gray and soft. For a moment, the adult lay still, letting the sound ground them. Rain meant windows stayed closed, doors stayed shut. Everyone moved slower. Good. They rose and went straight to the child's room. She was still asleep, curled around her pillow, one leg tangled in the blanket. Her face was relaxed, untroubled. The adult stood there, longer than necessary, watching her breathe, memorizing the calm. "She's okay," they whispered to no one. The morning routine unfolded quietly. Breakfast, shoes, jackets. The rain changed plans, kept them indoors longer. The child colored at the table while the adult answered emails and warmed leftovers for lunch. Everything felt ordinary again, almost too ordinary. Mid-morning, the adult remembered the reminder list and carried it to the kitchen counter. They smoothed it flat, studying the familiar handwriting. Each line simple, direct, written not in fear, but in preparation. Medicine away, windows closed, nothing on the edge. The adult nodded to themselves and folded it carefully, slipping it into a drawer near the sink. Somewhere easy to find. Somewhere it could do its quiet work. The rain slowed by early afternoon. The child asked to play in her room. The adult hesitated, then agreed, keeping the door open this time, staying within earshot. The hours passed without incident. By evening, the tension that had lingered since the night before had eased into something manageable. A cautious calm. The adult began to believe they'd reached the end of whatever chain of near misses had started with that first forgotten bottle. They cooked dinner. They laughed at something small. The child told a long, winding story about school that went nowhere and everywhere at once. Afterward, while the child took a bath, the adult walked through the house again, not out of fear this time, but habit, a new habit. One built on the old system, reinforced rather than undone. Everything was where it belonged. Later, with the child tucked into bed and the rain starting again outside, the adult sat alone in the living room. They didn't turn on the television. They just listened. They thought about the mother, not in the sharp, aching way grief usually arrived, but in quieter fragments. The way she used to pause before leaving a room, eyes scanning for anything out of place. The way she'd move objects without comment, never making a child feel corrected, only safer. Even after she had already passed, those instincts still echoed in the space she'd left behind. The adult stood and went to the mother's room. They hadn't planned to. It wasn't a deliberate choice, just a pull they didn't question. The room was unchanged from earlier. The bed still made, the closet closed, the nightstand bare except for the lamp and the photo. No bottles, no tablets, no movement. The adult stepped inside and closed the door behind them, turning on the lamp. They picked up the photo and studied it again. The smile there felt familiar, steady. The kind of smile that suggested not perfection, but attention. Care. "You thought ahead," the adult murmured. "You always did." They set the photo down and turned off the lamp, leaving the room in darkness again. As they opened the door to leave, something brushed their foot. They froze. Looking down, they saw it immediately. A small plastic eye cap, not attached to anything. Just the cap, lying on the carpet near the threshold. The adult's heart lurched. They crouched and picked it up, turning it over in their fingers. It was clean, uncracked, familiar. It belonged to one of the prescription bottles. The adult straightened slowly, scanning the room again. The nightstand, the dresser, the floor. No bottle. They stepped into the hallway, cap still in hand, and looked toward the bathroom. The cabinet door was closed. They opened it. The bottles were still there, all of them. Caps secure. The adult's pulse hammered. They closed the cabinet and leaned against the wall, forcing their breathing to steady. The cap had to belong to something, somewhere. They retraced their steps, moving room to room. Kitchen, living room, child's room. When they entered the child's room, they paused. The child lay asleep, unmoving. The nightlight glowed softly. The room looked safe. But on the dresser, near the back, something caught the adult's eye. They stepped closer. A bottle, not open, not loose, but there. The adult stared at it, disbelief washing over them. They were sure this dresser had been cleared, sure they'd checked this room last, sure. They reached out and picked it up. Cold. The cap in their other hand fit perfectly. They twisted it on and tightened it until it clicked. The adult closed their eyes. This wasn't carelessness anymore. This wasn't just old systems resurfacing. The box from the closet had been emptied hours ago. The bottles accounted for. This one should not have been here. They placed the bottle back down, then immediately picked it up again and carried it out of the room. They locked it away with the others, checking twice, then 3 times. Back in the hallway, they leaned against the wall, heart racing. The explanation hovered just out of reach. Not impossible, not magical, just elusive. Maybe they'd missed this one earlier. Maybe fatigue had filled in gaps again. Maybe the mind, under stress, created patterns where there were none. They returned to the living room and sat heavily on the couch. Minutes passed. Then, from the child's room, came a sound. Not a rattle, not a click. A soft, sliding noise like something being moved gently across wood. The adult stood instantly, fear and focus aligning once more. They walked toward the child's room, every step deliberate. The door was closed now. They hadn't closed it. They reached for the handle. Before they could turn it, the sound stopped. The adult held their breath, listening. Silence. They opened the door slowly. The room looked the same. The child still slept. The dresser stood undisturbed. But on the floor, near the bed, lay the reminder list, the one that had been in the kitchen drawer. The adult stared at it, mind racing. They picked it up. The paper was warm. Not from sunlight, not from the room. Warm, like it had just been held. The adult stood there, heart pounding, trying to fit this into a shape that made sense. Then the child stirred. She rolled onto her back, eyes fluttering open, still heavy with sleep. "Did you move my paper?" the adult asked softly. The child blinked, confused. What paper? The list, the adult said, holding it up. The child frowned. I didn't get up. The adult nodded slowly. Go back to sleep, they said, tucking the blanket around her. As they turned to leave the room, the child spoke again, voice small and certain. She doesn't like when you forget, she said. The adult froze. Who? They asked, though they already knew. The child yawned. Mom. The adult looked at the paper in their hand, at the careful handwriting, at the simple rules. They stepped into the hallway and closed the door gently behind them. The house was quiet again. But the adult understood now that whatever was keeping the child safe was not finished yet, because the systems were still correcting something, and the next mistake hadn't happened yet. The adult stood in the hallway for a long time after closing the child's door. The reminder list rested in their hand, warm enough that they kept shifting their grip as if the paper itself might speak if they held it still. The house had returned to quiet, but it wasn't the empty quiet from before. It felt arranged, as if something had been put back where it belonged. They walked to the kitchen and set the list on the counter, smoothing it flat once more. Medicine away. Windows closed. Nothing on the edge. 3 lines. Simple. Complete. The kind of rules you could live by without realizing they were rules at all. The adult leaned against the counter and let their head fall forward, resting their forehead against the cool surface. They breathed slowly until the pounding in their ears softened. Whatever this was, it wasn't noise in the walls. It wasn't shadows playing tricks. It wasn't anything that could be pointed to and named. It was correction. Small, quiet, persistent. They thought of the bottle being warm, the list appearing where it shouldn't, the way objects seemed to drift back into safer positions without being flung or dropped. Nothing violent, nothing dramatic, just nudged. The adult straightened and began to move through the house again, not in a frantic sweep this time, but in a careful, deliberate circuit. The kind of circuit the mother used to do, they realized, the one she never announced. They started in the kitchen, chairs pushed fully under the table, knife block turned so the handles faced inward. The fruit bowl shifted away from the edge. The adult paused there, remembering how the mother always turned things just a few degrees, never making a show of it. The bowl now sat where it felt right. They moved to the living room, cords tucked behind the console, remote placed flat, not near the corner of the table. The sliding door checked, then checked again. Locked. The adult didn't rush. They allowed themselves to feel the rhythm of it, to let each small action land. This wasn't about fear now. It was about alignment. In the bathroom, they lifted the child's stool and placed it flush against the wall, not angled where it could tip. They closed the toilet lid. They wiped a small splash of water from the counter and dried it thoroughly. In the hallway, they stopped outside the mother's room. They hesitated, then opened the door. The room felt calm, settled. The lamp was off. The nightstand bare except for the photo. The bed still made. The window closed. The curtain hanging straight. The adult stepped inside and stood there, hands at their sides. "I'm trying," they said quietly. They didn't expect a response. They weren't asking for one. The words were more like a promise spoken out loud so it could be held to. They left the room and closed the door gently. When they reached their own bedroom, they paused at the doorway, scanning the nightstand. Empty, clear, safe. They nodded to themselves and turned off the hallway light. Sleep came more fully, this time. Not deep, but steady. They dreamed of nothing in particular. Just rooms. Just light moving across walls. Just hands setting things down, picking them up, setting them down again. Morning arrived without incident. Sunlight crept in early, bright and clean, and the adult woke with a sense of cautious relief. They got dressed and went straight to the child's room. She was awake, sitting cross-legged on the bed, humming to herself. "Morning," the adult said. "Morning," the child replied, smiling. They watched her for a second, looking for any sign of lingering confusion or fear. There was none. She looked like a child who had slept well. "Did you have any bad dreams?" the adult asked. The child shook her head. "No." It was quiet. The adult nodded. Quiet was good. They went through the morning routine together. Breakfast, brushing teeth, shoes. The ordinary steps of a day that had no intention of becoming extraordinary. As they ate, the adult noticed the way the child thus instinctively moved her cup inward after setting it down, away from the edge of the table. The way she slid her plate closer when it drifted. The adult said nothing. Later, as they walked to school, the child skipped along the sidewalk, splashing in leftover rain puddles. She stopped suddenly and looked up. "She used to do that," she said. "Do what?" the adult asked. "Move things," the child said, swinging her backpack. "Not big things, just like that." She reached out and nudged a loose stone away from the curb with her shoe, clearing the path without thinking. The adult felt something warm and tight in their chest. "Yes," they said, "she did." The day passed without incident. Work was manageable. Messages were answered. The world outside the house behaved as expected. When they returned home in the afternoon, the adult unlocked the door and stepped inside first, scanning out of habit now rather than fear. Everything was as it should be. They cooked dinner together. The child helped by washing vegetables at the sink, carefully keeping the water from splashing onto the floor. The adult watched without comment, noticing the way the child paused before turning away, making sure the faucet was fully off. After dinner, the child asked to draw again. "In your room or mine?" the adult asked. The child thought for a moment. "Yours." "Okay," the adult said. They sat on the bed together, paper spread between them, crayons scattered in the middle. The adult noticed how the child placed the crayons deliberately away from the edge before starting. They drew quietly, side by side. For the first time in days, the adult felt something like ease settle into their shoulders. When it was time for bed, the child climbed under the covers without protest. The adult tucked her in and sat beside her for a moment longer than usual. "Can I ask you something?" the adult said. The child nodded. "When you said she doesn't like when I forget, what did you mean?" The child shrugged, eyes already heavy. "She likes when you remember the little things." The adult smiled softly. "I'll try." The child yawned. "You are." Her eyes closed. The adult stayed until her breathing deepened, then stood and left the room quietly. They turned off lights, locked doors, and went to their own bedroom, placing their phone face down on the dresser. They lay down and stared at the ceiling for a few seconds, then closed their eyes. Just as sleep began to pull them under, a thought surfaced. Not sharp, not alarming, just curious. They hadn't put the reminder list back in the drawer. They opened their eyes and sat up. The list was supposed to be on the kitchen counter. They were sure of it. They remembered smoothing it flat, leaving it there intentionally, wanting to see it in the morning. They stood and walked quietly into the kitchen. The counter was empty. The adult's heart gave a small, careful thump. They checked the drawer. The list wasn't there. They moved through the living room, then the hallway. They stopped outside the child's room. The door was closed, light off, quiet. They opened it slowly. The child slept soundly, curled on her side. On the nightstand, centered neatly beside the lamp, lay the reminder list, folded once, placed carefully. The adult stood very still. They did not touch it. They did not speak. They simply took a step back and closed the door again, gently, reverently, as if the room itself had asked for privacy. In the hallway, they leaned against the wall and let out a breath they'd been holding without realizing it. This wasn't a warning, it wasn't fear, it was guidance, and it was still happening. The adult returned to their room and lay down, staring into the dark. They slept lightly, aware now in a way they hadn't been before. Sometime later, how much later they couldn't say, they woke to a sound that didn't belong to the night. Not a rattle, not a click, a soft thud. They sat up instantly, heart racing. The sound had come from the child's room. They were out of bed in seconds, moving down the hallway, every sense alert. They reached the door and pushed it open. The room was dim, lit only by the nightlight. The child sat upright in bed, eyes wide, but not crying. On the floor beside the nightstand lay the reminder list, unfolded now, and next to it, a small plastic bottle on its side, rolling slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward the edge of the rug. The adult moved fast, crossing the threshold in 2 quiet strides, and dropped to a knee beside the nightstand before the bottle could reach the rug's edge. Their hand closed around it, stopping the slow roll as easily as catching a toy car on a slope. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't slam into anything. It didn't shatter. It simply stopped in their palm, warm from the room, real and ordinary and terrifying only because of what it represented. The child sat upright, blanket pooled around her waist, eyes wide and fixed on the bottle as if it had betrayed her. "I didn't touch it," she whispered. "I know," the adult said automatically, voice soft, steady, even though their heart was pounding so hard they could feel it in their throat. They set the bottle on the dresser across the room, far from the bed, far from small hands, far from edges. Then they picked up the reminder list from the floor. The paper lay open, the neat handwriting exposed like a set of rules someone had forgotten to hide. Medicine away, windows closed, nothing on the edge. The adult's fingers tightened on the page. "Are you okay?" they asked, turning back to the child. The child nodded quickly, too quickly. "I heard it," she said. "It went thump." The adult crouched beside the bed again. "What were you doing right before you heard it?" "I was sleeping," the child said. Then her voice dropped. "Then I woke up and it was moving." The adult glanced at the nightstand. It was close enough to the bed that a shifting blanket could bump it. A child's knee could nudge it in sleep. A pillow could have slid and pushed something over the edge. Even a small vibration from a passing truck could make a light object drift on polished wood. They forced their mind to stay in that lane, the lane where things had reasons. "Did your blanket fall?" the adult asked gently. The child looked down at the blanket around her waist, as if noticing it for the first time. "Maybe," she admitted. "I kicked." The adult nodded slowly. "Okay, that makes sense." But their stomachs still felt cold, because the bottle shouldn't have been on the nightstand to begin with, and now it was in this room, again, after all the checks, after all the locking away. The adult reached out and smoothed the child's hair back from her forehead. Her skin felt warm, normal. Her breathing was fast but steady. "You're safe," the adult said. "You're safe with me." The child swallowed. "Is it bad?" The adult chose their words carefully. "It's something you're not allowed to touch," they said. Like the stove. It can hurt you even if it doesn't look scary." The child nodded, eyes shining in the dim light. "I didn't want to," she whispered. "It just was there." The adult took a slow breath through their nose. "Okay," they said. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put that bottle away again, and you're going to stay in bed and keep your hands on the blanket, okay?" The child nodded again. The adult stood and carried the bottle out of the room, down the hallway, into the bathroom. They opened the high cabinet. All the bottles were still there, in a row, caps tight, labels turned away. The adult stared at them for a long second, then added the bottle they'd just taken, pushing it deep to the back. They closed the cabinet and latched it. Twice. Then they slid the small step stool farther from the counter, against the opposite wall, where it couldn't be pulled in front of the sink so easily. They turned off the bathroom light and stood in the hallway, listening. The house was quiet. The child's room was quiet. They returned to the child's bedroom and found her still sitting up, hands gripping the blanket like she'd been told. The adult sat on the edge of the bed. "Can you tell me what you were thinking when you woke up?" they asked. The child blinked, trying to understand the question. "I was thinking about her," she said. The adult's throat tightened. "About your mom?" The child nodded. "I dreamed she was fixing the room, like she used to." The adult didn't respond right away. They looked around the room, at the soft shapes of toys, the nightlight glow, the familiar safety of it all. The mother wasn't here. She had already passed. That was a truth the adult carried every day, in their bones. But the child carried something else, too. A memory that didn't need to be visible to feel real. A habit of thinking, if I call out, someone will answer. The adult reached out and took the reminder list from the nightstand where they'd placed it earlier in the day. No, they hadn't placed it there today. It had shown up there. The list was still in their hand. They folded it once and tucked it into their pocket instead, not because they were afraid of it, because they needed it close. "I want you to try to sleep again," the adult said. "I'll stay right here." The child nodded, lying back down slowly. Her eyes stayed on the adult as if she needed proof they wouldn't disappear into the hallway and leave her alone with the quiet. The adult stayed. They sat in the chair near the bed, posture stiff, eyes scanning without meaning to. The night passed in long minutes. The child's breathing gradually softened. Her hands loosened on the blanket. She drifted back under. The adult didn't sleep. They listened to the rain start up again outside. They listened to the pipes. They listened to the occasional creak of the house. They watched the shape of the child's chest rising and falling. At some point, their own eyes began to sting with fatigue. They blinked harder, refusing to let sleep take them. Their phone sat in their bedroom face down. They didn't want distractions. They didn't want anything pulling their attention away. Hours later, the gray light of early morning seeped in. The rain had slowed to a whisper. The adult finally stood, joints aching, and went to the bathroom to splash water on their face. When they returned, the child was still asleep. The adult let out a breath and decided to use the small sliver of calm to do something practical. They needed to remove the possibility of bottles appearing where they didn't belong, not by wishing, by systems, locks, habits, physical barriers. They left the child's door slightly ajar and moved to the bathroom. They opened the high cabinet again and took every bottle out, one by one. They placed them in a small pouch with a zipper, an old toiletry bag they'd never used. They zipped it closed. Then they put the pouch back on the highest shelf and wrapped a rubber band around the cabinet handle as an added barrier. It wasn't perfect, but it was another step. Then they checked the mother's room, because some part of them still didn't trust any surface in that space. They opened drawers, scanned shelves, checked behind framed photos, behind the lamp, behind books. In the closet, the box of old notes remained, now mostly empty. The adult pulled it out anyway and checked beneath it. Nothing. They returned it, pushed it back, closed the closet door. As they stood up, their eyes caught something on the closet shelf. A small pouch, fabric, floral pattern, the kind that used to hold makeup or hair ties. The adult stared at it. They didn't remember putting it there. They reached up and pulled it down, unzipping it cautiously. Inside were small items, a hairbrush, a few bobby pins, a tiny pair of scissors, and beneath them, another prescription bottle. Older, label worn, cap intact. The adult's mouth went dry. So that was it. Not magic, not impossible. Forgotten stashes, old habits, the mother's. Careful systems in places the adult hadn't looked yet. They'd been clearing, sorting, moving things, bringing long-hidden objects back into circulation, like turning over stones and releasing what had been safely buried. The adult held the bottle in their palm, feeling that familiar cold dread. They zipped the pouch, walked straight to the bathroom, and added the bottle to the zippered pouch on the top shelf. Then they checked the cabinet again. Rubber band. Secure. They moved through the house, checking again. Not because they expected danger to appear, because they were beginning to see how many hiding places existed in a home built around routines that had belonged to someone else. When they returned to the child's room, she was awake, sitting quietly with her stuffed animal pressed to her chest. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed," the adult replied. She looked at their face like she was reading it. "Are you mad?" "No," the adult said, sitting beside her. "I'm just serious." The child nodded. "I don't like the bottles." "I don't either," the adult admitted. They got ready for the day, moving slowly, letting the morning settle. The rain kept them home again. No rush, no school run in slick streets, a quiet day indoors. The adult kept the child close, but not tightly. They wanted her to feel normal, not watched like a suspect. The child drew at the table, watched a cartoon, built a small tower of blocks on the rug. Around midday, the adult felt brave enough to shower. They told the child to stay in the living room with her show. The shower was quick, but the adult's mind kept darting back to the nightstand, the rolling bottle, the thump. When they stepped out, towel around their shoulders, they heard the child's laughter from the living room. Normal. They dressed and walked toward the living room, already relaxing. Then they saw the hallway closet door, half open. They were sure it had been closed. The adult's steps slowed. In the living room, the child sat, cross-legged on the rug, eyes on the screen, giggling at something on TV. She looked up briefly when the adult entered, then returned to the show. The adult forced their voice to stay light. "Did you open the closet?" they asked. The child shook her head. "No." The adult walked to the hallway closet. It contained towels, extra linens, cleaning supplies up high. Nothing dangerous at child level, but the door opening on its own made the adult's nerves flare anyway. They opened it fully, scanning. Shelves. A folded sheet had slipped. A hanger was crooked. Nothing else. Then their eyes caught something on the floor of the closet, tucked behind a stack of old shoeboxes. A small, flat packet. The adult crouched and pulled it out. A blister pack, empty in places. The adult's breath hitched. They turned it over, searching for a name, a clue. The printed text was worn but readable. Not a brand they recognized. Not something new, something old, something that had lived here a long time. They held it between two fingers like it might burn. From the living room, the child's laughter continued, bright and unbothered. The adult stood slowly, blister pack in hand. They walked to the bathroom, locked the door behind them, and set the pack on the counter. Their hands shook now, the adrenaline returning, sharper because it was daytime, because it wasn't supposed to happen in daylight. They opened the high cabinet. The rubber band was still around the handle, the zippered pouch still inside. They removed it, unzipped it, checked the bottles. All there. They zipped it again, put it back, resecured the rubber band. Then they stared at the blister pack. How long had it been in that closet? How many were missing? Where had the missing ones gone? Their mind flashed to the tablet on the kitchen table, to the bottle in the bedroom, to the list appearing where it shouldn't. It wasn't one event. It was a web of leftover risks from a life that had ended, leaving behind systems and stashes, and habits, some protective, some dangerous, all hidden in corners. The adult returned to the living room and sat beside the child on the rug, forcing their voice to stay calm. "Sweetheart," they said softly, "I'm going to ask you again, and I need you to tell me exactly. Have you put any little white things in your mouth, even for a second?" The child looked at them, confused and slightly offended. "No," she said. "It's yucky." "Have you picked any up?" the adult asked. The child thought. "I picked up a crumb," she said. "From the couch." The adult nodded, trying to believe, trying to breathe. They didn't want to scare her. They didn't want to plant ideas. They needed to be careful. "Okay," the adult said. "Good. If you ever see something like that, you tell me." "Right away." The child nodded, more serious now. "Okay." The adult stood and walked to the kitchen drawer where they kept tape and markers. They pulled out a roll of bright tape and returned to the bathroom cabinet. They placed a strip of tape across the cabinet doors, like a seal, not to keep the child out. She couldn't reach anyway, but to tell themselves instantly if it had been opened. Then they did the same to the mother's closet, the hallway closet, the dresser drawers they'd checked. A simple system. A visible truth. If something moved, they would know. They returned to the living room, sat back down, and watched the child's show with her, their body tense but their face calm. Afternoon turned to evening. Dinner came, simple and warm. The child ate, chatted, then moved on to play. The adult checked the tape seals again and again, all intact. For a few hours, nothing happened. By bedtime, the adult's shoulders had dropped slightly, as if they'd finally found a way to hold control again. They tucked the child into bed, sat with her until her eyes closed, then stood to leave. As they stepped into the hallway, they glanced back into the room. The nightstand was empty except for the lamp and a book. No list, no bottle. Good. They closed the door gently and froze. On the bathroom cabinet, the tape seal was broken. Not ripped violently, not torn, just peeled cleanly, as if someone had lifted it carefully and then tried to place it back, but missed by a few millimeters. The adult's mouth went dry. They stood perfectly still, listening. From inside the bathroom came no sound at all. And then, down the hall, the child's bedroom door clicked, softly, like a latch settling into place. The adult did not move. They stood in the hallway, eyes fixed on the bathroom cabinet, on the thin strip of tape no longer aligned the way they had placed it. It wasn't torn. It wasn't crumpled. It had been lifted with care, then pressed back down slightly off-center, as if whoever did it had meant to leave it neat. Their breathing stayed slow, deliberate. They counted silently. 1, 2, 3. The click from the child's bedroom door echoed again in their mind, replaying itself with a clarity that made their skin prickle. A latch settling, not slammed, not forced, just closed. They turned their heads slowly toward the child's room. The door was shut. It had been open when they'd stepped into the hallway. They were certain of that. Certain enough to feel the weight of the certainty now pressing against their ribs. They took one careful step forward, then another, moving toward the child's room with the quiet precision of someone who didn't want to startle anything. Not a child, not a house, not their own thoughts. They placed their hand on the door and paused. "Sweetheart?" they called softly. No answer. They turned the handle and opened the door. The nightlight glowed as it always did, casting its small pool of warm light across the floor. The child lay tucked under the blanket, curled on her side, breathing slow and deep. Her stuffed animal was tucked beneath her chin. Her face looked peaceful, untouched by the tension coiling just outside the room. The adult watched her chest rise and fall, counting breaths until their own shoulders dropped a fraction. She was asleep. They stepped inside and closed the door gently behind them, then crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. They brushed a stray lock of hair from the child's face. Her skin was warm, normal. "You're okay," the adult whispered, unsure who they were saying it to. They stood and turned back toward the hallway. The nightstand caught their eye. On it lay a book. Nothing else, no paper, no bottle. Good. They left the room and closed the door softly, then turned back toward the bathroom. The broken seal waited for them, patient. They approached the cabinet and placed 2 fingers lightly on the tape, testing it. It lifted easily now. The adhesive had been weakened by being removed and reapplied. They peeled it off completely and opened the cabinet. The pouch sat on the top shelf, exactly where they'd left it. The zipper pull faced forward. The rubber band they'd added around the cabinet handle lay, loose, dangling, no longer taut. The adult's stomach tightened. They reached up, pulled the pouch down, and unzipped it slowly. Inside, the bottles lay nestled together. They counted them with their eyes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all present. They lifted each one out, checking caps, checking labels, checking weight. They lined them up on the counter in a neat row. Everything looked right. Too right. They zipped the pouch and placed it back on the shelf, then closed the cabinet door without, sealing it this time. Tape had done its job. It had told them what they needed to know. They turned off the bathroom light and stood in the hallway again, listening. The house was quiet. Not the empty quiet that felt hollow, not the alert quiet that felt like waiting. Just quiet. They returned to the living room and sat on the couch, elbows on knees, hands clasped together. They stared at the floor, at the faint reflection of the nightlight spilling down the hall. This was the point where fear usually tipped into imagination, where the mind, deprived of rest and comfort, started to fill in blanks with shapes it couldn't explain. The adult refused to let it. They took inventory instead. The child was asleep. The bottles were secured. The tape had been moved, but nothing was missing. The reminder list had appeared and reappeared, but it was a list. Paper, memory, habit. There were explanations. Not all of them satisfying, but explanations nonetheless. They leaned back against the couch and closed their eyes, forcing themselves to stay awake just a little longer. Minutes passed. Then from the hallway came a soft sound. Not a rattle, not a click, a sigh. The adult's eyes opened instantly. It was faint, barely there. The kind of sound you might mistake for the house settling or wind slipping through a crack. But this was different. It carried a rhythm, a shape. The adult held their breath. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone exhaling after finishing a small task. The adult stood. They moved toward the hallway, heart beating steadily now rather than wildly. This wasn't panic. It was focus. They reached the bathroom door. It was closed. They placed their hand on the handle, then hesitated. Not because they were afraid of what might be inside, but because opening it felt like crossing a line they hadn't crossed yet. They listened. Nothing. They opened the door. The bathroom was dark, empty. The cabinet closed, the counter clear, the floor dry. They turned on the light and scanned the room. Nothing had changed. They turned it off again and stepped back into the hallway. As they did, they noticed something new. On the hallway table, where keys and mail usually rested, lay the reminder list, unfolded. The adults stared at it. They were certain they hadn't brought it here. Certain they'd left it in the kitchen earlier. Certain they hadn't moved it since. They picked it up. It was cool this time, not warm. They read the 3 lines again, then noticed something they hadn't before. At the bottom of the page, in smaller handwriting, almost an afterthought, was a 4th line. Check again. The adult's breath caught. They lowered themselves into the chair beside the table, list trembling slightly in their hand. That line hadn't been there before. They would have noticed it. They were sure they would have noticed it. They thought back to the box in the closet, to the notes they'd sorted through, to the lists and reminders and systems the mother had built. It was possible this list had always had 4 lines. It was also possible they had only seen 3. Memory, like fear, was not always reliable. The adult stood and did exactly what the list asked. They checked again. They moved through the house one more time, slower now, calmer. Kitchen, living room, bathroom, closets, bedrooms, everything was as it should be. They returned to the hallway table and folded the list neatly, placing it inside the drawer this time, beneath a stack of envelopes. They closed the drawer firmly. They stood there for a moment, then nodded to themselves. Enough. They returned to their bedroom and lay down, exhaustion finally heavy enough to override vigilance. They closed their eyes and let sleep take them. This time it came quickly. They dreamed of walking through rooms filled with light, of hands setting objects down, then moving them again, of a voice they couldn't hear clearly, but trusted anyway. They woke to morning sunlight spilling across the bed. For a moment, everything felt normal. They sat up, stretched, and swung their legs over the side of the bed. They stood and walked into the hallway, glancing automatically toward the child's room. The door was open. The bed was empty. Their heart jumped, but only briefly. From the kitchen came the sound of a chair scraping softly across the floor. "Good morning," the child called cheerfully. The adult let out a breath and walked into the kitchen. The child sat at the table, drawing again. A bowl of cereal sat in front of her, a cup of water beside it, everything placed carefully away from the edge. "Did you wake up early?" the adult asked. The child nodded. "I was hungry." "You didn't wake me," the adult said, keeping their tone light. "You were sleeping," the child said matter-of-factly. "She said it was okay." The adult paused. "Who said?" they asked gently. The child shrugged, focused on her drawing. "Mom." The adult swallowed and poured coffee, needing something warm in their hands. They sat across from the child and watched her draw. The picture took shape slowly. A house, a window, a table, small shapes carefully centered on surfaces. "That's nice," the adult said. The child smiled. "She likes it neat." The adult nodded. The morning passed without incident. The adult worked from home, checking in on the child often. The tape seals remained intact. The cabinet stayed closed. The list stayed in the drawer. By afternoon, the adult allowed themselves to believe the worst had passed, that the system, old and new, was holding. Then, while folding laundry in their bedroom, they heard the sound again, a soft rattle, not loud, not close, from the mother's room. The adult froze, a folded shirt still in their hands. They set it down slowly and walked into the hallway. The mother's door was open. They stepped inside. The room looked unchanged. The bed made, the nightstand bare. The rattle came again, from the closet. The adult's heart thudded as they crossed the room and opened the closet door. Inside, the box sat where they'd left it, open. And on top of the folded notes, carefully placed in the center, lay a single prescription bottle, its cap loosened just enough to make sound. The adult stared at it, pulse roaring. They knew this bottle. They had counted it. They had locked it away. They reached out and picked it up. It was warm. From the hallway, the child's footsteps approached. The adult turned just as the child appeared in the doorway. Her eyes went straight to the bottle. "Oh," she said softly. "That one." The adult's voice came out barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, that one?" The child stepped closer, gaze steady. "She always moved it first," she said. The adult didn't answer right away. They stood there in the doorway of the closet, the bottle warm in their hand, the child's words hanging in the air between them like something fragile you didn't dare touch too quickly. "She always moved it first." The adult looked down at the bottle again, really looked this time. The loosened cap, the familiar shape, the weight of it in their palm. It wasn't heavy, it never had been. That was part of the danger, how something so small could matter so much. "Moved it where?" the adult asked quietly. The child stepped closer, careful, as if the room itself had rules she understood without being taught. She didn't reach for the bottle. She didn't reach for the box. She just pointed. "Up," she said. "Away, not here." The adult swallowed. They nodded once and did exactly that. They turned, walked down the hallway, into the bathroom, and opened the high cabinet. The pouch was there. The rubber band still looped around the handle, slightly stretched now but intact. The adult unzipped the pouch and placed the bottle inside with the others, then zipped it closed and pushed it as far back as it would go. They didn't rush. They didn't check the count again. They didn't need to. When they closed the cabinet, they did it with intention, with the kind of care that wasn't about fear anymore, but about respect. They turned back to find the child standing in the doorway, watching. "It's okay now," the child said, not asking. "Yes," the adult said. "It is." They walked back together to the mother's room. The adult knelt and slid the box of old notes deeper into the closet, behind heavier things, until it could no longer be reached without effort. They closed the closet door. Then, after a moment's thought, they moved the small table that sat beneath the shelf, pushing it to the opposite wall. The child watched all of this quietly, absorbing not the actions themselves, but the pattern of them. When they finished, the room felt different, not emptier, just settled, as if something unfinished had finally been put back into place. The adult stood and turned off the light. In the hallway, they paused. "I need to tell you something," the adult said. The child looked up. "Your mom isn't here anymore," the adult said gently. It wasn't new information. They both knew that, but saying it out loud mattered. "She can't come and move things herself." The child nodded. "I know. But," the adult continued, choosing the words carefully, "she was very good at teaching us how to keep you safe." The child thought about that. Then she nodded again. "She left the rules." The adult felt their chest tighten. "Yes," they said softly. "She did." That night, the adult stayed with the child until she fell asleep, not sitting rigidly, not scanning the room, just present. The nightstand remained clear. The door stayed slightly open. The house was quiet in a way that felt earned. When the adult finally went to bed, they slept. Deeply. No rattles woke them, no clicks, no soft sounds of things being adjusted in the dark. Morning came gently. The adult woke before the child and went through the house once more, not because they were afraid of what they'd find, but because this was the rhythm, now. Cabinets checked, doors locked, edges cleared. In the kitchen, they noticed the reminder list on the table, folded neatly. They frowned, trying to remember moving it. They couldn't. But this time, the feeling that came with that realization wasn't panic. It was familiarity. They unfolded it and read it again. Medicine away. Windows closed. Nothing on the edge. Check again. They smiled just a little and slid it into the drawer by the sink where it would stay. The child padded in a few. Minutes later, hair tousled, eyes sleepy. "Breakfast?" she asked. "Yes," the adult said. "What do you want?" The child climbed onto her chair and looked at the table, then reached out and pulled her cup a little closer to the center before answering. "Cereal," she said. The adult watched the small motion, the unconscious correction, and felt something warm settle where fear had lived before. The days that followed were quieter, not perfect, just careful. There were no more bottles appearing where they shouldn't. No more lists traveling through the house. No more sounds in the night that made the adult's heart race. But there were reminders everywhere. In the way the adult paused before leaving a room now, eyes scanning. In the way the child stopped herself before climbing, before reaching, before touching. In the way objects slowly found safer places without anyone announcing it. Once, while cleaning, the adult found another note tucked inside an old book. Not about medicine. Just a single line, written in the same familiar handwriting. "Slow is safe." The adult taped it inside the cabinet door. Life went on. School mornings, grocery trips, ordinary dangers that never announced themselves until they were already too close. And each time, without thinking, the adult moved first. A bottle lifted from a table, a door checked twice, a chair pushed back where it couldn't be used as a step. Sometimes the child noticed, sometimes she didn't. But once, much later, as the adult moved a glass away from the edge of the counter, the child looked up and smiled. "You did it like her," she said. The adult paused, hand still on the glass. "Did what?" they asked. "Moved it first," the child said. The adult nodded. "Yes," they said. "She taught me." That night, after the child was asleep, the adult stood in the hallway one last time and looked around the house. Everything was where it should be. They turned off the lights and went to bed. And for the first time since the night, the bottle had rattled on the nightstand. The adult understood something clearly and without fear. The protection had never been about things moving on their own. It had been about learning to see them before they did.